Thank you very much, Boris, for that very generous, very generous and slightly overdone introduction. I wish it were true. I wish it were true. It's a great honor to be asked to deliver this very important lecture in the year in which we mourn the passing of Baroness Thatcher. And I don't know about you, but I thought the truly amazing thing about her funeral was how many people turned up. Do you not think it was extraordinary? And the next most amazing thing was how relatively well behaved they all were, because the BBC had done its best to foment a mood of uprising, I thought, and with habitual good taste they played Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead on taxpayer-funded radio. They were asked to find some commentators to give an instant reaction to the death of Britain's greatest post-war Prime Minister, an event that was not exactly unforeseen, sad though it was, and they reached instinctively for Ken Livingstone and Gerry Adams, two of her bitterest foes outside, that is, the circle of wets in the Tory cabinet. As her cortege wound its way from St Bride's to St Paul's, there were a few people so stupid that they heckled the mortal remains of an 87-year-old woman. A few turned their backs. Some wore twerpish Guy Fawkes masks or carried signs saying boo. But the mass of humanity, anybody who was there will agree with this, was on her side. And when the dissenters erupted, they were swiftly drowned by cries of shh or calculated volleys of applause. I know all this partly from media accounts and partly because obviously I walked through the crowds and I saw how various her mourners were. There were some tweedy-looking types and there were some suited thrusters, as you would expect, and people who wouldn't be entirely out of place in a Tory party conference, but there were also people from all over London, immigrants from every race and colour, people that the BBC, I don't know why I'm bashing the BBC, why not, people that the BBC might not have marked down instinctively as natural Thatcherites, and yet who had come to pay their respects to a woman who spoke to them and spoke for them as no other politician has done. And the Thatcher backers commanded the crowd to such an extent that some young people were frankly taken aback. And I read an excellent blog post by Lucy Sheriff pointing this out. She interviewed two students from UCL who had plainly come hoping for a bit of the old G20 type argy-bargy. And one of them said, "We are pretty surprised at the lack of protesting. Considering she was such a divisive figure, there's been very little on that front." And the second one admitted, "We're a bit disappointed." And it's easy to see how anyone who'd been exposed to the curriculum in most UK schools could form a low opinion of Margaret Thatcher. Look at the questions they set for A-level politics, which I have troubled to excavate over the last couple of years. Question: the industrial disputes of the 1980s were primarily the result of Mrs. Thatcher's desire to destroy the power of the trades unions. 45 marks. Question: decline in support for the Conservatives and their continued electoral unpopularity were due to the legacy of Margaret Thatcher. 45 marks. Margaret Thatcher's achievements as Prime Minister in the years 1979 to 1990 were limited. 45 marks. And so on. I wonder how many candidates got 45 marks, Morris, by dissenting vigorously from those ludicrous assertions. For millions of poor, misinformed students, she is simply a name to hiss, a byword for selfishness and bigotry, and yet I don't blame young people. All they have to go on is Russell Brand and the BBC and what their teachers tell them. They weren't around in the 1970s. Well, I was. Anybody around in the 1970s? You don't look like you were around in the 1970s. Anybody here around in the 1970s? I was around. And I remember what it was like and how this country was seen. Our food was boiled and our teeth were awful, our cars wouldn't work, and our politicians were so hopeless that they couldn't keep the lights on because the coal miners were constantly going out on strike, as were the train drivers and eventually the grave diggers. And the man who was really in charge seemed to be called Jack Jones. And I remember as a kid how deserted London seemed, comparatively deserted to what it is today. People fled to Essex or elsewhere. And I remember the Well, who knows? Well, why not? And the needs must. And I remember the stringy grass in the parks and the Spangles wrappers. Do you remember? And the bleached white dog turds. Remember that? And the gust of Watney's pale ale from the scuzzy pubs. And I even did a painting. I did a painting as a child to express my feelings about this country, and it's modelled on the old advertisements you used to find at Taunton Station. Did anyone remember when you were pitched up at Taunton Station, there was a big sign saying, "Welcome to Taunton, home of Van Huysen shirts." Anyone remember that? Well, I did a landscape, a bleak and uninviting vista of the white cliffs of Dover in the rain with a few runty-looking gulls, and the caption said, "Welcome to England, home of the economic crisis." I produced it, and I've got it here. I've got to produce this. Here it is. Can you see that? There it is. And I produced this Meisterwerk. I produced this Meisterwerk in January 1975, so you can see that I was already a pretty irritating 9-year-old. And 4 years later, things, of course, were even worse, because Red Robbo paralysed what was left of our car industry, and the country went into an ecstasy of uselessness called the Winter of Discontent. Women were forced to give birth by candlelight. Prime Minister's Questions was lit by a paraffin lamp, and Blue Peter was all about how to put newspaper in blankets for extra insulation. In March that year, Sir Nicholas Henderson was retiring from Paris and writing his traditional valedictory letter to the Foreign Secretary. "Our economic decline has been such as to sap the foundations of our diplomacy," he lamented. "Today, we are not only no longer a world power, we are not even in the first rank as a European one." 2 months later, of course, Margaret Thatcher won her first majority and began the process of reversing that view of Britain in this country and around the world. In 1981, she took on the expert opinion of 364 economists who wrote a pompous letter to the Times calling for a U-turn in her budgetary policies, and she routed them by delivering a supply-side revolution in Britain whose benefits we enjoy to this day. In 1982, she showed positively Churchillian pluck by deciding to tell the Americans and the Peruvians to stuff their peace plan, and she sent the Navy halfway around the world on a spectacularly risky venture. And by the end of the year, Galtieri was gone, and the military junta was no more, and the principle of the Falklanders' right to self-determination was vindicated. In 1983, she took on Neil Kinnock and the Labour Party and gave them the most spectacular drubbing. In 1984, she squared up to the miners. Yes, she did square up to the miners, as the A-level question suggests, but she didn't provoke that confrontation to answer the A-level question. She was facing a challenge from a Marxist demagogue who had no real interest in the welfare of the miners, and who refused even to call a ballot before the strike, whose avowed purpose was to bring down the elected government of the country. Needs to sit down. She took on the European community over UK contributions to the budget, and she won. And in 1986, she took on the member for Henley, always a risky venture. Any Conservative Party leader, over some question about helicopters. And though she won that round on points, she sowed the seeds of her future destruction. By the time she was eventually felled by her own MPs, cravenly hoping that they would save their seats, her achievements weren't limited, they were colossal, and they were in many cases irreversible. She had introduced millions of people to the satisfaction of owning their own home. She massively widened share ownership. She had tamed the power of the unions, and she'd given back to British management the right and the power to manage. She'd also done something less tangible and more important. She'd changed the self-image of this country. And to grasp what she did, you have to remember how far we as a country felt we had fallen. Our country, Britain, used to rule the world, almost literally. I mean, of the 193 present members of the UN, we have conquered or at least invaded 171. That is 90%. The The only countries that seem to have escaped are places like Andorra and the Vatican City. I suppose we'll get round to it in the end. In the period 1750 to 1865, we were by far the most politically and economically powerful country on earth. And then by 1914, we were overtaken by America, we were overtaken by Germany, and we had the World Wars. And we ended up so relatively weakened that the ruling classes succumbed to a deep morosity that bordered on self-loathing, and we gave in to the reverse of the fallacy that gripped the Victorian imperialists. Because the Victorians were so vain as to believe that because they'd managed to extend their pink dominions east and west all over the globe, they assumed that this must somehow reflect the reality of divine providence, and that God saw a special virtue in the British people and appointed them to rule the waves, a view that many of you may still share, after all. But what the post-war generation found, they'd grown up reading this blimpish stuff, and they then drew the logical but equally absurd conclusion that the shrinking of Britain must also represent a moral verdict on them all. But in this case, the opposite, that we were now decadent, that decline had set in like Death Watch Beetle in the church tower. Decline. And Thatcher changed all that. She put a stop to the talk of decline, and she made it possible for people to talk without the slightest embarrassment about putting the great back into Britain. And she gave us a new idea, or at least she revived an old one, that Britain was, or could be, an enterprising and freebooting sort of culture, with a salt breeze ruffling our hair, a buccaneering environment, where there was no shame, quite the reverse, in getting rich. She transformed the idea of Britain, the Schwerpunkt, as they say in Germany, I think. The mission statement, from the sick man of Europe to bustling, dynamic entrepot, and nowhere was that transformation more extraordinary than in London. The other night I was sitting next to the great director and producer Stephen Daldry, who did such an imaginative job with the Olympic ceremonies and so helped us to lay on the most amazing global advertisement at a trifling 9.3 billion that this country has ever seen. And he was asking me, because he'd just been in Brazil, he said, what is going on? All they can talk about all around the world is London, London, London. The whole world seems to want to come here. What's it all about, he said. And I mumbled some discreetly self-aggrandizing nonsense about how we were all working very hard to promote the city overseas. And only later I realized, of course, what I should have said to the great Stephen Daldry, because it is this same genius, after all, who was responsible, you may remember, for giving British kids their most vivid and terrifying image of Margaret Thatcher. Yes, the evil termagant from Billy Elliot. It was the cast, anybody seen Billy Elliot? It was the cast of Billy Elliot the musical who had decided to keep singing one of their biggest hits, in which everyone praised for the death of Margaret Thatcher, on the very day that she was laid to rest. And had I been thinking faster, I should have said that Margaret Thatcher, whom he'd so brilliantly demonized, laid the foundations of the prosperity that the city enjoys today. It was she who went for the Big Bang in 1986, unleashed the animal spirits of the Essex men and women who mingled with ever-growing numbers of suave American and European bankers, and restored London to its Victorian eminence as the financial capital of the world. And it was the 1980s boom in the city that financed the tapas bars and the restaurants and the arts world and the musicals, I should have pointed out to him. And it was that change in the quality of life that brought people back to our city. And we forget now how far London had shrunk by the time Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister. Down from 9 million in 1911, 9 million people we were. 1911, 9 million in 1939, by the way. Down to 6.9 by 1981. And it's now, I'm proud to say, back up to 8.2 million. We've gained an extra 600,000 since I have been mayor. No thanks to me, I may say. It was Margaret Thatcher, I believe, who created the conditions in which this became possible. She put in the fixed link to Paris, enabled this constant va-et-vient of banquiers. She pioneered Canary Wharf. She green-lighted the Jubilee line. She turbocharged the city, and she cut personal taxation from 83 to 40% and laid the foundations for modern London's success. And that's, of course, what I should have said to Stephen Daldry had I been thinking faster. And I might have added that it sometimes feels as though the 1980s are about to come round again. And I can see, I don't know whether anybody, any great CPS economic analysts agree with me, but I can see it in the cranes on the skyline, in the traffic jams, even though we have heroically increased average traffic speeds in London from 9.3 to 9.4 miles an hour. I notice the queues for restaurants, and I notice the sharp increase in house prices, and although I may be wrong, my impression is that the vast and intricate machine of the London economy is starting to throb on the launching pad like a Saturn V rocket, and as the vapor starts to jet from the valves, I sense a boom in the offing. Gerard Lyons, my economic advisor sitting in the second row, trying to avoid my eye, thinks we could be looking at growth of 4% next year. And so I think it's the right time to say that I hope in many ways it isn't like the 1980s all over again. I don't imagine that there will be a return of teddy bear braces and young men and women driving Porsches and bawling into brick-sized mobile phones and that kind of. That's not going to happen. But I also hope that there is no return to that spirit of loads of money heartlessness, figuratively riffling banknotes under the noses of the homeless. And this time, I hope that the Gordon Geckos of London are conspicuous not just for their greed, and I accept the CPS view that greed is a valid motivator of economic progress, as for what they give and do for the rest of the population, many of whom have experienced real falls in their incomes over the last 5 years. And if there is to be a boom in the 20-teens, I hope it is one that is marked by a genuine sense of community and acts of prodigious philanthropy. And I wish the snob value and prestige that the Americans attach to the act of giving would somehow manifest itself here more vividly. Does that sound too sententious? Why not? Why not? And yet, after that rather preachy point, it was Margaret Thatcher who made the key observation about charity in her famous analysis of the parable of the Good Samaritan. He wouldn't have been much use to the chap who fell amongst thieves, she noted, the Good Samaritan, if he had not been rich enough to help. And what has been really striking about the last 5 or 6 years is that no one on the left, no one, from Paul Krugman to Joe Stiglitz to Will Hutton, let alone Ed Miliband, has come up with any other way for an economy to develop, except by capitalism. After the crunch of 2008, we all waited for the paradigm shift, didn't we? The left was ushered center stage and missed their cue. Political history reached a turning point and failed to turn, almost a quarter of a century after the collapse of Soviet and European communism, a transformation that Mrs. Thatcher did so much to bring about. There has been no intellectual revival of her foes, has there? And indeed, their precepts are only now conserved by weird cults in South London, apparently. So I say to the anti-Thatch protesters, I say, ding dong. Ding dong is ding dong, Marx is dead. Ding dong, communism's dead. Ding dong, socialism's dead. Ding dong, Clause 4 is dead. And it is not coming back. Like it or not, the free market economy is the only show in town. Britain is competing in an increasingly impatient and globalized economy in which the competition is getting ever stiffer. And no one can ignore the harshness of that competition or the inequality that it inevitably accentuates. And I'm afraid that violent economic centrifuge is operating on human beings who are already very far from equal in raw ability, if not in spiritual worth. Whatever you may think of the value of IQ tests, it is surely relevant to a conversation about equality that as many as 16% of our species have an IQ below 85, while about 2%, but anyway, 16%, what do you want to put up your hands? 16% have an IQ below 85, 2% have an IQ above 130. And the harder you shake the pack, the easier it will be for some cornflakes to get to the top. And for one reason or another, boardroom greed, or as the people in the boardrooms assure me, the natural and God-given talents of senior executives, the income gap between the top cornflakes and the bottom cornflakes is getting wider than ever. And I stress, I don't believe that economic equality is possible. Indeed, some measure of inequality is essential for the spirit of envy and keeping up with the Joneses and so on. That is a valuable spur to economic activity. But we cannot ignore this change in relative economic standing and the resentment it sometimes brings. Last week, I tried to calm people down by pointing out that the rich pay a much greater share of tax than they used to. When Margaret Thatcher came to power in 1979, they faced a top marginal tax rate of 98%, and the top 1% of earners contributed 11% of the government's total revenues from income tax. Today, when taxes have been cut substantially, the top 1% contributes almost 30% of income tax, and indeed the top 0.1%, just 29,000 people, contribute fully 14% of all taxation. 29,000 people paying 14% of all taxation. That's an awful lot of roads and schools and hospitals that are being paid for by the super rich. So why, I asked innocently, are they so despicable in the eyes of all right-thinking people? Surely they should be hailed like the Stakhanovites of Stalin's Russia, who half killed themselves in the name of the people by mining record tonnages of coal. And I propose that we should fete them and decorate them and inaugurate a new class of tax hero with automatic knighthoods for the top 10%. Well, my friends, I'm proud to say that I have often been accused of being out of touch. But hardly ever have I produced such a frenzied and hate-filled response. People aren't remotely interested in how much tax these characters pay. That does nothing to palliate their primary offence, which is to be so stonkingly, and in the view of many, so emetically rich. The other day, I was stopped in the street by a woman who was sobbing with anger. And there were two aspects to her complaint. The first was about pay disparity. She worked in the accounts department of a big UK firm, and over the last 20 years, she had seen how salaries at the top end had been pulling away from everyone else. And the next complaint was her belief, which I believe is only partly correct, that the London property market is dominated by rich foreigners, and they'd so driven up house prices as to make it impossible for her daughter to find anywhere to live. And as I say, I believe this antipathy to foreign investment is very largely misplaced. Yes, there are certainly parts of the city where a large proportion of sales are going overseas. And yes, it would be a good thing if new homes were targeted first at Londoners and not sold off-plan in foreign capitals. But even in the hotspot areas, foreign sales are running at the same, did you know this? Running at the same rate as they were in 1990. And across the city as a whole, they are running at 6.5% by value, the same as 20 years ago. And as I tried to explain to this woman, it is foreign investments that enable us to go ahead with developments like the one at Battersea that would otherwise be stalled forever. And it is those new developments, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of new homes, that offer real hope for her and her daughter. And I think, in the end, I won her round. I think she could see the logic of some of what I was saying. But sometimes in politics, you have to realize that you're dealing with feeling and not reason. And after 5 years of recession, people are feeling this inequality. Does anybody agree with me? I think they are feeling it. Even members of the CPS, particularly members of the CPS audience, are feeling it, because it is all about differentials. And they're feeling it more strongly, obviously, than in the 1980s, because inequality is greater. And they care about it. People care about it, rightly or wrongly. And it seems to me, therefore, that though it be wrong to persecute the rich, and madness to try and overtax them, given the competitive position we need to maintain, or to stifle wealth creation, futile to try to stamp out inequality, that we should only tolerate this wealth gap on two conditions. One, that we help those who genuinely can't compete, and two, that we provide opportunity to those that can. And get back to my cornflake packet for a second. I worry that there are too many cornflakes who aren't being given a good enough chance to rustle their way to the top. And we gave the packet a good shake in the 1960s, a big era of social mobility. Mrs. Thatcher gave it another good shake in the 1980s with the sale of the council houses. And since then, there has been a lot of evidence of a decline in social mobility, as John Major has trenchantly pointed out. And as some people may know, it is one of the many black marks against me that I went to the same school as the party leaders, and I can't hide it. I went to Primrose Hill Primary School, Camden, the alma mater of Ed Miliband, the Labour leader, a school that obviously exercised an unhealthy grip on British politics. There are many reasons for this decline in social mobility, this apparent freezing of the canals of opportunity. I'm going to grab some water. Can you hear me still? Thank you so much. Some explain the decline of social mobility by reference to what's called assortative mating, which is the process by which the massive expansion of the female population in higher education has meant an intensification of marriages and partnerships between bourgeois university-educated couples and an increase in their economic advantages. And some say, of course, it's not to do that, it's to do with the function, it's the work ethic, and they draw unflattering comparisons between the get-up and go of our indigenous kids and hard-working migrants from EU accession countries. And some say it's all to do with the abolition of the grammar schools. And here we have to admit that the record of our heroine is very far from perfect. Indeed, she closed more grammar schools than Tony Crosland. But the question I'm asking today is not what did Maggie do then, but what would Maggie do now? For 45 marks. And that's the question I think we need to ask, isn't it? 45 marks, CPS, what would Maggie do now? And I think she would have taken the question of social mobility very seriously indeed. I think she'd want to help smart and hard-working kids everywhere. She was a grammar school girl herself. She knew what it was like to be up against the kind of smug, sleek men who never thought she would have the dream that she would be a minister and prime minister, or that she had the guts to sack them. I think she would have instantly brought back suppose she was here now, let's do this thought experiment, what would Maggie do now? I think she would instantly bring back the assisted places scheme that helped 75,000 people find excellent education in the fee-paying sector. She might not flood the whole place with grammar schools so-called, because not under that name, right? Because that would have been a U-turn, and we know what she thought of U-turns. But I hope that were she here now, she would find some way of making far wider use of that most powerful utensil of academic improvement. And that is academic competition between children themselves. Is that an unthinkable thing to say? No. Yeah, is it? Come on, CPS. It isn't. I remember once sitting in a meeting of the Tory shadow education team and listening with mounting disbelief to a conversation in which all agreed solemnly that it would be political madness to try to bring back the grammar schools. Well, I happen to know that most of the people in that room were about to make use, as parents, of some of the most viciously selective schools in the country. I might be wrong, but I hope she would find a way to use that device and to help bright children everywhere overcome their background. And even if I'm wrong, I feel that she would direct a beam of maternal and terrifying devotion upon Michael Gove and everything he does. I'm sure she will. And if we haven't quite restored academic competition between pupils, there's a new spirit of competition between those who are the driving force behind our academies. If you talk to the hedge fund kings who are supporting this new breed of maintained sector school, they will rave about how their school has just been rated Ofsted outstanding in every category, with the joy of the Queen beholding her horse win the Derby. I think Mrs. Thatcher would approve of that spirit of rivalrous emulation as means of driving up standards, just as she would approve of apprenticeships, every other means of getting young people the cunning and confidence to succeed in a place of work. She'd understand the best hope of social mobility is an open and flexible labour market, and where people can move from one career to another rather as they can in America, and where business is always creating new jobs. And we come now to the juddering climax of our discussion. I realise that there may be some confusion now in my prescriptions between what I would do and what I think Maggie would do, and what the government should do, or indeed what the government is about to do, or possibly is already doing, did we but know about it. And I just want to say I don't think that much matters, because I think all three are likely to turn out to be one and the same. What would she do about tax and spending? What would Maggie do now about tax and spending? What's the right approach to the economy? To coin a phrase, I hope it's not too obvious to say that she would cut the cost of government wherever she could. She would cut spending as the economy recovers, and she would cut taxes such as business rates, and she would ensure that our rates of personal taxation were at least competitive with the rest of Europe. What would, to answer the question by the woman who berated me in the street, what would she do about housing? I think she would recognise the squeeze on her core voters, their desperate shortage of homes, and she would revive her great mission of a property-owning democracy and encourage the creation of hundreds of thousands of new homes in which people at least had a share of the equity, even if they couldn't own it outright. And I think she will remember the lessons of Baldwin and Macmillan and Thatcher, that Tories are most successful when they help Middle Britain to find the housing they need. What would she do about infrastructure that a growing economy depends on? There are some who remember her hostility to railways. She didn't seem to much like trains, if you remember, possibly because of her conflict with chaps like Jimmy Knapp. She used to like catnapping in the back of her Jaguar, I seem to recall. And I think you would certainly therefore want to upgrade the roads, but we are talking here of the Thatcher who gave Britain our first and so far only high-speed rail, I think. Yeah, she did. And I think, and not to mention the DLR, by the way, which doesn't go quite so fast. I think she would understand the capacity argument for HS2, though she might get it a good deal cheaper and get a bigger contribution from business to pay for it. As for our aviation capacity issue, let me remind you of that valedictory letter that I already quoted from Nico Henderson on the eve of her accession to power. This is what Nico Henderson, our man in Paris, said. Remember, he was groaning away about how diminished Britain was, and he said, "So far as the management of major capital projects by government is concerned, our vision appears limited and our purpose changeable. We started work on two large plans, the Channel Tunnel and the third London airport, only to cancel both." Does anyone here doubt that she would have the cojones to rectify that mistake and to give this country the 24-hour hub airport with 4 runways that it needs? Does anybody actually do it? She'd sort it out. Maggie, you should be here now. When she was in power, there were flights from Heathrow to more destinations than from any other European airport. I don't think she would sit back and watch the rest of them eat our lunch. The French, the Dutch, the Germans, the Spanish, the Finns, for heaven's sake, who now send more flights to China than we do. Finns ain't what they used to be, I can tell you. She would understand. She would understand that the plane is the 21st century means of travel, and the vital importance of air connectivity to her vision of Britain. Open, free trading as turned to Asia and Latin America as it is to its traditional markets. She would see also, I believe, I'm sort of channeling here a bit here, that the best place to build that airport would be to the east of the city, which is also the area with the biggest potential for new homes. This is turning into a kind of seance, isn't it? What would Maggie do about the rest of our country? What would she do about regional policy? I think she would be fighting like a lioness for the Union. And I think that next year she would comfortably see off Alec Salmond, just as she's seen off so many other smart Alecs, because she would have instinctively understood the heart of the matter. This isn't about whether or not the Scots will be £800 worse off per head per year. This is about the demolition of Britain. It's about taking the blue background from the Union flag, lopping the top of the most successful political union in history. It would diminish both Scotland and England, and it would be absolutely no consolation to me or to her that the loss of Britain as a concept might also jeopardise the concept of the British Broadcasting Corporation. I think she would win the case for the Union, but she would also recognise that England has so far been shortchanged by devolution. Yes? Yeah. So I like to think that she would look at what is happening in the great cities of England, where the population is also rising and changing, and a London effect is noticeable as people flee the high costs of the capital and start, it's absolutely true, all the billiard ball effects happening in Manchester and Leeds and Birmingham, they start dynamic new businesses in tech and other sectors. And I hope she would remember the municipal conservatism of Joe Chamberlain and indeed Alderman Roberts, and give those cities more powers to raise locally the taxes they spend locally, and give local politicians an incentive to go for policies that promote growth, and give the electorate an incentive to kick them out if they fail and install conservatives, as they have done in London. And what, finally, amigos, because we cannot avoid it, mes amis, what would she have done? What would she do? What would she do now about Europe? Last year, we heard at this lecture how Charles Moore told us that she had, in her later years, decided to pull out. And since Charles has papal infallibility, in my view, on this as on every matter, I accept that. But it's obviously one of those things that is a bit easier to say to your trusty biographer when you are out of office and you aren't immediately besieged, having said it, by panic-stricken Foreign Office wallers and the CBI and nervous international investors from India and China and the White House on line one saying, "Are you out of your mind, baby?" As it happens, and I've got to be absolute, I don't think that were she now the tenant of number 10, I don't think she would pull us instantly out of the single market, which, after all, in 1986 she helped to create. I think that she would be pursuing a program of pretty robust reform, and she would recognize that there is a chance to get a better deal from Europe. And I think she would agree that it's time to sort out the immigration system so we end what is currently a totally mad situation. At the moment, we are claiming to have capped immigration by having a 60% reduction in New Zealanders, when we can do nothing to stop the entire population of Transylvania, charming though many of them, almost all of them, doubtless are, from trying to pitch camp at Marble Arch. And David Cameron, I think, is completely right about giving countries more flexibility over the time lag before other nationals may claim benefits. And I can't believe he is alone among EU leaders. It's time we ended the Soviet absurdities of the CAP, time we sorted out the Working Time Directive, and time we generally persuaded the Eurocrats to stop trying to tell us what to do. First, they make us pay in our taxes for Greek olive groves, which probably don't exist, Potemkin olive groves. And then I read the other day, they said that we can't dip, have you seen this? They said we can't dip our bread in little pots of olive oil in restaurants. And we finally think we're sophisticated enough to use olive oil. And they say we can't. We didn't join the common market, betraying the New Zealanders and their butter in order to be told when and how we must eat olive oil that we have been forced to subsidize. And when you talk about Brussels taking the pip, I know what you mean. Mrs. Thatcher wouldn't have put up with it, and I think she would have got a better deal, and she will get a better deal, because we're imagining her doing it now. And I think what she would be able to persuade her colleagues round the table when they look at what's going on in the rest of the European Union economy, particularly in the Eurozone, that it would be in their interests as well. And she would simultaneously keep us in that internal market council that reassures international investors. And at the back of her mind, to fortify her in the negotiations, would be this comforting truth that after 40 years of EU membership, I believe the stakes are considerably lower than they were. Because the EU, after all, has shrunk to only 19% of the global economy, the EU 20, compared to 29% as it was when she was in power. And she knew then, and I'm sure she would act on this now, the big growth markets for our country lie elsewhere. And there is therefore a paradox in our relations with the EU. As I said at the beginning, we joined in the early 1970s. There it was, home of the economic crisis. 1975, I've updated it. When we in a mood of weakness and defeatism. And since then, I think things have changed. It's not just that we stayed out of the euro, another thing that Margaret Thatcher got completely right. Here. Or that we are recovering fast while the Eurozone is still a microclimate of gloom. Consider the demographics. By 2050, Britain will be the second biggest country by population in the EU. It will be bigger than France. It will be only 2 million behind Germany by 2050. And by 2060, I can see you gulping already, we will have more people than Germany. And yeah, I don't know exactly where they're all going to go. I mean, we've got lots of room in London, 33 brownfield opportunity areas. We can do it. We could definitely do it. When I drive through the wonderful northern cities of this country, I see plenty of depopulated space. I can't tell you exactly how it will work. And nor can I easily tell you what it will be like for us psychologically, suddenly to be the biggest and most economically powerful, potentially, country in Europe. But I will chance my arm, and I will make some final prophecies. By the middle of this century, I intend still to be alive, of course, in common with everybody else here, I hope. We will still, 2050, we will still have a crown, won't we? We'll still have a monarch. Yes? Well, I believe we'll still have a union. Yes. We will still have a dynamic, diverse, globalized economy. And I think we will have dealt eupeptically and by the normal romantic human processes with the recent period of mass immigration, so that our cities are not just proudly British, but also boast a vast mongrel energy. And speaking as someone who boasts a certain amount of mongrel energy, I know what I'm talking about. And as for London, it will have lengthened its lead as the financial, the artistic, and cultural capital of the world. A city that already has more American banks here in London than there are in New York. Yes? Already has more Michelin-starred restaurants here in London than there are in Paris, or used to until quite recently when the French, in a completely Stalinist decision, decided to award more Michelin stars to their restaurants because they were so furious about London's performance. We already have less rainfall than Rome, a meteorological fact that is unlikely to change. And we have more green space and will continue to have more green space than any other European city. And by 2050, we will have improved this city dramatically. We will have not just Crossrail, we will have Crossrail 2. Crossrail 2, linking Hackney and Chelsea, helping all those commuters in southwest London. We'll probably have Crossrail 3, taking you out to the Margaret Thatcher International Airport in the Thames Estuary. If not Crossrail 4. If not Crossrail 4. Some things, of course, will still be the same. We will still have beautiful parks and lovely pubs, and the Tower of London and Julian Assange will still be holed up in the Ecuadorian embassy, wasting police time and resources. But one thing will have gone forever. One thing will have changed forever. And that is the myth of British decline. Here in London, we already lead in law. We have more of the top law firms than any other city on earth. We lead in universities. We have 4 of the top 10 universities in the world. We have the largest tech sector now in Europe, the largest biotech sector outside Boston. We export TV shows around the world. I think we have 13% of the global market for TV shows, far more than any other city and probably more than any other country. 5 of the last 6 global best-selling music albums emanated from this city. And we have exported Piers Morgan to America. And we may not have gunboats. We may not have gunboats anymore as we did in the days when we invaded or conquered 171 members of the UN. But we hardly need gunboats anymore because we are already fulfilling what I think of our destiny as the soft power capital of the world. And that, to conclude, is very largely thanks to a woman who knew all about soft power and hard power, and above all, about the deep Freudian terror that every man possesses for the inner recesses of a handbag. It was her fundamentally positive and can-do vision that turned this country around and that we should remember today. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
This was a wonderful lecture, I know you agree. Here's a promise, Boris.
Yeah.
There will be a Thatcher CPS lecture in the Thatcher International Airport when you've built it.
Absolutely.
Please come and join Boris, myself, other directors of the CPS, all our guests in the hall at the back. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks.
It's wonderful
Thanks,
you were here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Boris.
Thank you.